Imagine waking up one morning in your bedroom, pulling back the curtains of your window, and gasping at what you saw outside. Standing outside of your home, there were hundreds of people, just standing there. They're not talking, they're just staring at your window. And every few minutes, more and more people join the crowd, just staring at you in your home. This was the experience of Yukiko Sugihara on a summer morning in late July 1940. Yukiko was the wife of the highest-ranking Japanese diplomat in Kaunas, Lithuania. And this unusual crowd, this crowd that had gathered outside of her home that morning, well, they were there for one very powerful reason. They didn't want to die. And because of that, they were waiting for her husband to wake up. The driving force behind this was Zorak Varhaftig. We met him in part 1 of this amazing true-life story of freedom. Zorak Varhaftig was a man of vision and will. Zorak Varhaftig told anyone who would listen that all Jews who remained in Lithuania would likely suffer the same fate of all Jews who were now captured under German control in nearby Poland. The problem for Zorak Varhaftig and anyone else in Lithuania was that the tyrants to their east and west held power over them. They had control, and that mechanism of control was the passport. And it prevented Zorak Varhaftig and anyone else in Lithuania that summer from leaving. But now, Zorak Varhaftig had uncovered a means of escape, a means of outsmarting the devil and stealing away from Lithuania through a series of white lies, half-truths, and, well, frauds, stamped and scribbled onto their passports. Zorak Varhaftig and 200 yeshiva students from one of the largest and best-known yeshivas of the time, the Mir Yeshiva, well, they had just unlocked one gate, one barrier to their escape from Lithuania that summer. Now they needed to unlock a second gate. They needed a transit visa to cross Japanese-controlled Manchuria on their way to Pacific ports in the Far East and to freedom. As the morning drew on, that late summer in July of 1940, eventually the doors of the Japanese consulate opened, and from those doors stepped forward a diplomat. His name was Chunye Sugihara. And from the crowd emerged our man, Zorak Varhaftig, flanked by a small delegation. The Japanese diplomat was very polite, although he was a little puzzled by the crowd outside. Nevertheless, he very graciously welcomed Varhaftig and his delegation into his office. There, the two men, Varhaftig and Sugihara, sat down. Each one appraised the other. However, Varhaftig had no way of knowing at the time, but the man who sat across from him, the vice-consul of the Empire of Japan in Lithuania, Chunye Sugihara, well, he was not only a diplomat, he was also a spy. And Sugihara was very, very good at his job. In many ways, Sugihara was the ideal person for that diplomatic post there in Kaunas. At an early age, he had demonstrated a natural talent as a Russian area specialist. He studied the Russian language at Japan's Diplomatic Academy in Harbin, Manchuria, which is now part of China. At the time, Harbin was on the frontier of East and West. It was a Chinese city controlled by the Empire of Japan and populated with Russians who had fled the Bolshevik Revolution in their homeland. Sigihara married one of those Russians who had fled the communist takeover of her country, and eventually he converted to her Orthodox faith. Now as a young official in the Japanese diplomatic corps there in Harbin, Sigihara quickly applied his fluency in Russian to magnificent effect. The breakthrough moment in his early career occurred in the mid-1930s. This was when Sigihara was assigned to help negotiate Tokyo's purchase from Moscow of the China Eastern Railway. This famed link, part of the Trans-Siberian Railroad, connected Port Arthur in the Far East to European Russia by train. The railroad itself had become this perpetual military and diplomatic sticking point, first between Japan and Imperial Russia, and now with the new Soviets who had taken over the Kremlin. By 1933, the communist government there in Moscow was short on cash. And the Soviets? Well, they were looking to sell this once prized imperial gem of Tsarist Russia, China Eastern, to Japan. One of the perpetual sticking points in this sale to Japan was the price of the railway itself. Under no circumstances would Sigihara's Russian counterparts budge on the original asking amount. But thanks to a bit of, I'd say, gumshoe investigative work, Sigihara tapped into his network of Russian-speaking contacts around Harbin, where the negotiations were taking place. And on account of this deep network, Sigihara soon discovered something that no one in the Japanese diplomatic corps seemed to know. Under the Soviets, large sections of the China Eastern Railway had fallen into disrepair. This was certainly something that Sigihara's Russian negotiators had obviously neglected to mention in their talks with Japan. China Eastern was not worth nearly as much as Moscow was demanding, and Sigihara could prove it. As a result, Sigihara succeeded where previous Japanese negotiators had failed. He had broken the deadlock over China Eastern by combining his mastery of the Russian language with the shrewd instincts of a corporate raider. And the price was reported to be a total steal for Japan, about 170 million yen in 1930s money. This successful diplomatic and commercial deal had attracted the attention of Sigihara's bosses back in Tokyo, and partly as a reward for his efforts, Sigihara was appointed to the prestigious post of Deputy Foreign Minister of the Imperial Japanese Government in Manchuria. It was a huge promotion and a career-making moment for Sigihara. Only soon after receiving his appointment, Sigihara resigned the position. He did so in protest over Japan's mistreatment of the local Chinese population in Manchuria. You see, Sigihara was a man of ambition and talent, yes, but he was also a man of conscience. While his peers in the diplomatic corps, well, they may have cast a blind eye to Japanese abuses of the local population, Sigihara could not. More importantly, he was willing to stake his career on it. Following his resignation as deputy cabinet minister, Sigihara departed Manchuria for Japan. He divorced and remarried and soon became a father to his new wife, Yukiko Sigihara. Being a new father, well, that meant that Sigihara, a guy without a job, he needed to make money, and he was eager to take whatever position he could get from the Empire of Japan. By 1938, Sigihara was working as a lowly translator at the Japanese embassy located in Helsinki, Finland. This position was a far cry from the short time he had served as deputy foreign minister there in Manchuria. But war was coming. and Tokyo was now very much in need of Sigihara's unique skill set. We know from pre-war documents that, back in Japan, defense planners had concluded that a military conflict between the Soviet Union and Germany was a foregone conclusion. Nothing could stop it. If so, the biggest question for Japan was, when would the peace between Germany and the Soviet Union finally break? That was what Tokyo wanted Sigihara to find out. And his next destination was Kaunas, Lithuania. Operating under diplomatic cover, Sigihara was promoted to the rank of vice consul, and he was officially assigned to Lithuania to oversee the opening of a new Japanese consulate there in Kaunas. Officially, he was to be the highest diplomatic representative of the Empire of Japan there in Lithuania. Unofficially, his orders were to use his on-the-ground knowledge and whatever information networks he might establish to provide intelligence on German and Soviet troop movements around Lithuania. By November 1939, Japan opened its new consulate in Kaunas, and it was led by the very energetic and talented vice consul, Sigihara, a diplomat and a spy. Now, for anyone who was actually paying attention to Sigihara, they might have noticed that the Japanese diplomat and his family were fanatical about picnicking. They always seemed to be on trips to explore the fields and forests and streams of the Lithuanian countryside. Now, sure, Lithuania's countryside, it's remarkably picturesque. But it was almost certainly on these picnics that Sigihara was gathering information along the border and perhaps taking clandestine meetings away from the prying eyes and ears back in Kaunas. What's more, this Herculean task of collecting intelligence on neighboring troop movements required more than the work of just one individual. So, for help in these matters, Sigihara relied on the assistance of exiled Polish military and intelligence officers. These were soldiers who had fled the advance of German forces into their country, and now they were located in nearby Lithuania. They were individuals like Lieutenant Leszek Daskiewicz. After the fall of Poland, Daskiewicz and his compatriots, well, they would quietly visit the Japanese consulate and provide Sigihara with information from beyond Lithuania's borders. It was because of this ad hoc Polish-Japanese intelligence cooperation that Sigihara was able to provide Tokyo with remarkably accurate information about German and Soviet military dispositions in the region. And then came the morning of July 27, 1940. The morning when Sigihara and his wife opened the curtains of their bedroom and looked outside. Now sitting down in his office with Zorak Warhaftig, Sigihara was moved by the stories of Jewish refugees who had fled the German invasion of their country. He learned from Warhaftig how German forces had bombed their cities and towns. Warhaftig explained to Sigihara the types of horrors that Jews in Lithuania would face if they didn't get away from this danger right now, if they didn't escape Lithuania. And Sigihara believed him. It was at this point that Warhaftig produced a map. He pointed to the island of Curacao in the West Indies and explained his plan of escape. He explained that the Dutch consulate across town there in Kaunas was already issuing end visas to Curacao, and all he needed from Sigihara were 10-day transit visas across Japanese territory in the Far East. After this pivotal meeting with Warhaftig, Sigihara returned to his family's private quarters located on the second floor of the consulate where they lived. The stakes of the decision he had to make were enormous, and his wife watched him. He sat at a table in silence and drank some coffee. He waited for a while until the crowd outside grew silent. Then he stood up and went to the window. He looked outside. His wife, Yukiko, joined him at the window, and together the husband and wife watched the crowd grow, waiting just outside of their fence. Later that evening, according to Yukiko, it seemed that many cares for the Jewish people occupied his mind, and it was during this time that Sigihara recalled a passage from the Book of Lamentations, written by Jeremiah, a prophet and a poet, when he witnessed the fall of Jerusalem thousands of years before. According to Yukiko, the line that Sigihara recalled was this: "Zion stretches out her hands, but there is no one to comfort her." What was Sigihara to do? As a first step, Sigihara cabled his home office in Tokyo for guidance. The response from the Japanese Foreign Ministry was unsurprising. Tokyo did not want to be flooded by Jewish refugees from Lithuania, and they instructed Sigihara to follow the letter of the law when issuing transit visas. Most importantly, anyone who received a transit visa had to really prove, that they had money, and lots of it, for the trip. Sigihara could see with his own eyes that the crowd, which continued to grow larger outside of his home, well, this was not comprised of wealthy people. In fact, many in the crowd appeared to be very, very poor. So Sigihara tried again. He sent another note back to Tokyo, asking for some level of flexibility, some way to perhaps bend the rules, or maybe make an exemption to them in just this case. And he waited, with no response back from home. And that was a very big problem. You see, for Zvorak Varhaftig and anyone else who wanted to join his exodus, time was running out. Every hour that passed, every day that passed, without an answer from Sigihara became an enemy. Remember, the Soviet Union had ordered all foreign consulates and embassies in Lithuania to close up shop and depart the country by the end of July. Located in the Dutch consulate across town, the accidental diplomat Jan Zwardendik, well, he was working overtime to stamp out as many dubious end visas to Curacao to anyone who wanted them. But that consulate had to close at the end of the month, just a few days away. What's worse, the initial request for 200 visas had now ballooned into the thousands as word spread throughout the city that the Dutch consulate was providing end visas to Curacao. The exodus was getting larger. And in the last few weeks of July, Zwardendik was pumping out visas to Curacao like a forger on a printing spree. All of this would have to end on the 1st of August. All diplomatic missions would have to close. Sigihara knew all of this, and he internalized the plight of the people who continued to gather outside of his gate. He remembered there was no place else for them to go. They trusted me. If I had waited any longer, even if permission from Tokyo came, it might be too late. So, in the final days of July, Sigihara made his decision. I could not allow these people to die. I may have disobeyed my government, he said, but if I didn't issue the visas, I would have disobeyed my God. It was at this decisive moment that Sigihara would join the ever-growing list of conspirators who would help to turn this seemingly impossible idea of escape from Lithuania into reality. It was also here that Sigihara demonstrated his ultimate brilliance. It was to find that indistinguishable gap between duty and insubordination. Tokyo had instructed him to follow the letter of the law, to follow the rules, yes. That meant that every refugee had to, at least officially, meet all requirements for a transit visa. Practically no one did. However, what if Sigihara simply assumed that everyone met all the requirements? He just wouldn't ask them. That solved his problem with Tokyo, but it didn't solve the problem of time. Again, the clock was ticking. Time was running out. So Sigihara made an official request to the Soviet Union for an extension, and he received one. He would be allowed an extra 30 days to keep his consulate there in Kaunas open. After that point, there would be no more extensions, and he must leave the country. And so, Sigihara opened the doors to the consulate. He let in the crowd, and he began to issue Japanese transit visas. And it was here that he promptly discovered a problem. You see, writing out in longhand the Japanese characters for each and every transit visa, well, that took a lot of time. Much longer than it did to write it out in French or Dutch or any other Western language. The characters of Japanese were so meticulous, it just took too long. And it was at this point where the ad hoc Polish-Japanese intelligence cooperation would save the lives of thousands. Polish intelligence officers offered to create for Sigihara a stamp. If he would simply provide to them an example of what a Japanese transit visa should look like, their master forgers would provide to him a stamp that he could use to expedite the paperwork. Sigihara agreed, and, ever ingenious, Polish intelligence had not one stamp but two made, allowing them to eventually mint even more transit visas once Sigihara closed his office in 1 month's time. Over the next several weeks, Sigihara worked like a machine. He was up before the sun and still stamping visas long into the night, day in and day out. But that second gate, that second obstacle that was impeding the escape of Jews trapped in Lithuania, was now unlocked. With passports and national IDs in hand, and an end visa to Curacao, and a transit visa across Japanese-controlled Manchuria, all that Zvarhak Varhaftig and members of his exodus needed now was to open the final gate, that final barrier, an exit visa from the Soviet Union. In the end, this final authorization was perhaps the easiest to acquire. Communist authorities dutifully approved exit visas for anyone with the proper documentation. Why were Soviet authorities suddenly making it very, very easy to leave the USSR? That never happened. It turns out everyone involved had their own theory as to why. The first was expedience. By occupying Lithuania that summer of 1940, the Soviet Union inadvertently inherited a gigantic refugee problem. All Polish Jews who had escaped the German occupation of their homeland were now concentrated in Lithuania. Why not just let them leave? A second possible motivation was money. At the time, Soviet authorities were extracting between $170 and $240 in 1940s money from every exit visa that they issued to Lithuania's Jews. In fact, we know that Moscow was able to raise about $500,000 in 1940s money, which was a lot, for the Soviet Travel Bureau just by extracting a fee from every Jew who wanted to escape Lithuania. The third motivation was espionage. Before Moscow would grant an exit visa, each refugee had to submit to an interview with the NKVD. This was the dreaded forerunner of the KGB. In at least 2 cases that we know of, and likely many more, the NKVD attempted to recruit escaping Jewish refugees to spy for the Soviet Union. Individually or collectively, each one of these motives is plausible, and perhaps it was a combination of all 3. The refugees were an unexpected burden for the Soviet Union. Moscow needed hard currency, and the NKVD was in a unique position to establish informants all around the globe. Unfortunately, the precise reasoning behind Moscow's decision to issue the exit visas might never be known. What we do know is that the individual who was responsible for approving the exodus of Jews from Lithuania at the time was Vladimir Dekhanozov. He was the dreaded deputy head of the NKVD, and upon Stalin's eventual death, he was promptly arrested and executed by the new regime. All records of his life, his notes, papers, awards, orders, photographs, well, they were all collected and destroyed upon his arrest and execution. He was erased from Soviet history, and with it, any proof of the true thinking, the true motivation behind the decision to allow Zorak Varhaftig's exodus to proceed. But for Zorak Varhaftig, the reasoning really didn't matter. All that mattered is that the green light was there. He and everyone else who was joining him could now escape. By the first week of September 1940, Sugihara was in very bad shape. With every visa that he issued, Sugihara would have known that he was perhaps saving a life, or the life of an entire family. This was because one family could travel on a single visa, so he had no idea how many lives he was saving with every stamp and signature. That drove him, and he would not stop. He worked 16-hour days without a break, but that work was now taking its toll, and he was exhausted. His wife, Yukikyo, remembered, he was like a sick person. But the time for issuing visas, for Sugihara, that too was coming to an end. The month-long extension that the Soviet Union had granted to him earlier that summer was now expiring. It was time for Sugihara to end his mission and close his consulate. Officially, Tokyo had ordered him to relocate to Berlin, where he would continue to act as a diplomat. But Sugihara told his wife, "I can't make it to Berlin." And so he suggested that the 2 of them, with their family, check into a hotel and rest for a bit before leaving. But for Sugihara, there would be no rest. At least not yet. When we got to the hotel, Yukikyo recalls, the Jewish people came looking for us, so he wrote some more visas at the hotel. The next day, when we got to the train station, they were there too. Even as Sugihara's family boarded the train to Berlin, he continued to stamp visas on the platform. And then he got on the train. It was a powerful, emotional moment for Yukikyo and her husband. Every visa was potentially one more life that he could save. Once we were on board, she said, they were hanging out of the windows, and he wrote some more visas. When the train started to move, he couldn't write anymore. Everyone was waving their hands, and Yukikyo couldn't stop crying. As the train for Berlin pulled away from the station, Sugihara tossed the transit visa stamp out of the window into the waiting crowd. It would be his last act as the Imperial Vice Consul of Japan to Lithuania. Zorak Varhaftig and his community of Jewish refugees from Poland, including Pesla Lewin, her husband, her family, and all members of the famed Mir Yeshiva, would escape by rail across Siberia and they would arrive at the Japanese-controlled port of Port Arthur along the old China Eastern Railway. That was the same line that Sugihara had once negotiated away from the Soviet Union. From there, many went in different directions. Most went to Kobe, Japan, where many stayed and established a Jewish community there that still endures to this day in that city. Some went to Shanghai. Others crossed the Pacific and arrived in the United States. Zorak Varhaftig would eventually make his way to British Palestine and become a key member in the establishment of the State of Israel. His exodus had succeeded, and all those who joined him escaped the Holocaust. All those who remained in Lithuania suffered a very different fate. The next summer, in 1941, Germany eventually broke that uneasy peace with the USSR and invaded Lithuania, Belarus, Ukraine, and Russia. More than 130,000 of Lithuania's Jews would die in the Holocaust as a result. And the vibrant Jewish society and civilization that had existed in Lithuania for almost a millennia would be nearly destroyed. That unimaginable loss made the lives of those who survived, those who escaped, all the more precious. In fact, of the roughly 2,200 Jews who had escaped Lithuania that summer of 1940, well, their children and their grandchildren and all of their descendants would number more than 40,000 living today all around the world. For his immense service in saving the lives of thousands, the name of Chunye Sugihara would be declared righteous among the nations, and his name would be inscribed as a hero of the Holocaust, as Yad Vashem. And what about our accidental diplomat, Jan Zvardendig? Well, after the war, Zvardendig continued to work for Philips Radio, serving as the country's director in Greece and finally retiring to the Netherlands in 1956. It was not until 1976 when a historian contacted Zvardendig to inquire about his role in the events of that summer in Kaunas back in 1940. At the time, Jan Zvardendig was dying of cancer, and the historian was surprised to discover that Zvardendig had no idea about the role that he had played in saving the lives of so many people. Then, in September of 1976, a letter arrived for Jan Zvardendig. It was from a rabbi in Kobe, Japan, home to a Jewish community that had existed ever since that exodus in 1940. In this letter, the rabbi documented for Zvardendig the documented name, age, gender, profession, and outward destination of 2,200 Jews that Jan Zvardendig had helped to save from the Holocaust. That letter arrived on the day that Jan Zvardendig was buried. He never saw it. Nearly 2 decades afterwards, the name of Jan Zvardendig would also be added to the list of righteous among the nations. He too would become Yad Vashem for his role in rescuing thousands of Jews from Lithuania that summer. Many of those he saved, those who had escaped, had never even learned his name. They simply called him the Angel of Curacao. Do you love freedom and fellowship and learning more about the story behind the story of some of the greatest events in history? Well, if you do, I hope you subscribe. And join us over at Locals, where we have weekly live chats and Twitter spaces with subscribers and supporters to find out more about stories of freedom. It's a great community, and I hope you join us.